The day I lost everything, I was wearing a $4,200 Chanel dress, and underneath it, a pair of rubber cleaning gloves stuffed into my coat pocket. My name is Maya Belmont. I was 35 years old. I had a penthouse on the Upper East Side, a daughter in private school, and a LinkedIn profile that said, Senior Risk Analyst, First Manhattan Capital. I analyzed risk for a living. I was considered brilliant at it. I did not see my own destruction coming. It arrived on a Tuesday, in a plain white envelope. I remember holding it under the light in my kitchen, the kitchen with the Italian marble countertops and the sub-zero refrigerator I hadn't fully paid for. And I thought, this is probably nothing. A routine letter from my father's attorney. Richard Belmont's people were always sending paperwork. Always something to sign, something to approve. I opened it. Inside was a single page. A bank statement for the trust fund my mother had spent 30 years building. She was a pharmacist from Queens who never once bought herself a designer anything. She clipped coupons. She worked double shifts on holidays. She built $4.2 million from nothing. And when she died, she left every penny to me. The balance on that statement? $147.12. I read it 3 times. I thought there had been a printing error. I actually laughed. That short, confused laugh you make when something is so impossible your brain simply refuses to process it. Then the men arrived. 2 of them. Suits, clipboards, rolls of red tape. They walked past me into my living room like I was furniture, and they began sealing off my mother's Steinway piano, the one she played every Sunday morning. The one that still had her fingerprints on the keys, with thick yellow tape. Property under lien. I called my father. He answered on the 3rd ring. I could hear waves in the background, wind, the clink of ice in a glass. "Sweetheart," he said, and his voice was warm, almost gentle. "The crypto markets collapsed. I lost everything too. Don't be selfish about this. I haven't slept in weeks." And as he said those words, as I stood in my mother's living room watching strangers seal up her piano, I looked up at the television in the lobby of my building across the street. The screen was visible through the glass. It was a live press conference. My father, Richard Belmont, tanned, smiling, standing on a dock in Miami, next to a woman younger than my graduate school diploma. Behind him, a banner. Belmont Coastal Development, $40 million project launch. He was still on the phone with me. "Dad," I said very quietly, "I'm looking at you right now." Silence. Then the line went dead. That night, I posted a photo to Instagram. A champagne flute, the hem of my Chanel dress. The caption, "Some nights just feel electric." The truth? I had taken the subway to that party because I couldn't afford an Uber. I had worn that dress over the thermal undershirt I wore to my second job, the one nobody knew about. 3 nights a week, from midnight to 4 in the morning, I cleaned office buildings in Midtown. I was a fraud. A beautifully dressed, perfectly curated fraud. But here is what I want you to understand. That night, standing in the cold outside my own building, staring at a lock I could no longer open, something happened inside me. The grief burned off. The shame burned off. What was left was something I had never felt before in my life. Clarity. I was going to get every dollar back. And I was going to make sure Richard Belmont lost a great deal more than money. The morning after I was locked out of my own home, I showed up to work at First Manhattan Capital in the same Chanel dress. I had nowhere to change. I sat down at my desk, opened my computer, and smiled at my colleagues like it was any other Wednesday. By 10 o'clock, my badge stopped working. I stood at the security turnstile like an idiot, swiping it over and over. The guard, a young man named Carlos who had wished me good morning every single day for 4 years, looked at me with something worse than anger. Pity. He made a phone call. HR came down in person, which is never a good sign. They walked me to a conference room, offered me water, and slid a termination letter across the table. Your credit score has fallen below the threshold required for employees handling sensitive financial accounts. My credit score? My father had spent the last 18 months quietly, methodically opening credit lines in my name. Loans I never applied for. Debt I never knew existed. He had used my social security number, the one he had memorized since he filled out my birth certificate, to build a financial ghost that followed me everywhere and owed everyone. I was not fired because I failed at my job. I was fired because my own father had turned my identity into a weapon and pointed it at me. I walked out of that building carrying a cardboard box with a cactus, a coffee mug, and 4 years of my professional life. I stood on Lexington Avenue in the November cold, and I thought, who do I call? I called my husband. Daniel didn't answer. I want to tell you about Daniel Marsh. 41 years old, corporate attorney, owned exactly 3 good suits and wore them on rotation. He was not a remarkable man. He was the kind of man you marry because he seems safe, steady, the kind who comes home for dinner and remembers your mother's birthday. What I did not know, what I was about to learn, was that Daniel had been on my father's payroll for over a year. I found out the way you find out things you were never supposed to know, by accident. A text notification that appeared on his laptop while he was in the shower. A name I recognized, a number with too many zeros. When I confronted him, he didn't even bother to lie well. Your father came to me, he said, very calmly, like he was explaining a business transaction. He offered to settle your mother's estate cleanly if I could get you to sign the waiver. I thought it was the best outcome for everyone. The best outcome for everyone. I had signed that document 4 months earlier. I had signed away my right to investigate my mother's estate because my own husband sat across the breakfast table from me and said, Maya, fighting this will cost more than it's worth. Just let it go. I had trusted him. And then he said something that turned the temperature in the room to absolute 0. I'll be filing for primary custody of Sophie next week. Given your current circumstances, no income, no permanent address, I think the court will agree she's better off with me. Sophie, my daughter, 8 years old. She still slept with a stuffed elephant named Gerald. I looked at my husband standing in our kitchen, his kitchen now, I supposed, and I felt something shift permanently inside my chest, like bone resetting after a bad break. Painful, but somehow more stable than before. I picked up my keys, my purse, a photograph of Sophie from the refrigerator door. Daniel, I said, and I was surprised by how steady my voice was. You just made the worst decision of your legal career. I had nowhere to go, no job, no home, no money beyond the $40 in my wallet. But I had something my father had never counted on. I had spent 14 years analyzing how financial crimes are committed. I knew exactly what he had done, and I was beginning to understand exactly how to undo it. There is a specific kind of cold that lives inside a car in New York in November. It gets into your bones differently than regular cold. It's patient. It finds every gap in your coat, every place where the seat doesn't quite meet the door. It reminds you, every single hour, exactly where you are and exactly how far you have fallen. Sophie slept in the back seat, with her coat pulled over her shoulders and Gerald, the stuffed elephant, tucked under her chin. She was 8 years old, and she had asked me exactly once why we were sleeping in the car. I told her it was an adventure. She looked at me with those dark, serious eyes, her grandmother's eyes, and she said, "Okay, Mommy." She believed me, and that simple, unconditional trust was the single most painful moment of my entire life. I had told Daniel I was taking Sophie for the week. He hadn't fought it. Not yet. His attorney hadn't filed the paperwork. I had maybe 7 days before the legal machinery started moving. 7 days to become someone my daughter didn't have to lie to. During the days, I kept up appearances. I dropped Sophie at school in that old Volvo like every other parent. I wore my last clean blazer. I smiled at the other mothers in the pickup line, women I had known for 3 years, women I had co-chaired fundraising committees with, women who had eaten at my table. One of them, Patricia Holloway, had seen me drive up in the Volvo. I watched her lean toward another woman and whisper something. They both glanced at me with that particular expression, not quite cruel, not quite kind. The look that says, "I am so glad that is not me." The school sent a letter that same week. The fall fundraising gala required a suggested contribution of $15,000 per family. Suggested, as if it were optional. As if every parent in that room didn't know exactly who had paid and who hadn't. I did not go to the gala. Instead, I sat in my car in a parking garage on 86th Street, eating a granola bar, watching Instagram on my phone. Former colleagues at rooftop bars, acquaintances checking into Michelin-starred restaurants, Patricia Holloway posting photos from the school gala, candlelight, champagne, a string quartet, and then my father. A gossip column photo. Richard Belmont, 63 years old, silver-haired, tuxedo, at a charity dinner in Palm Beach. The caption called him a prominent New York philanthropist and financial visionary. Philanthropist. The man who had stolen my mother's life savings, who had buried me in fraudulent debt, who had bribed my husband, who had left his granddaughter sleeping in a parking garage. Philanthropist. I threw my phone onto the passenger seat so hard the screen cracked, and then I sat in the dark and I cried. Not the elegant, dignified kind of crying, the ugly kind. The kind that comes from somewhere deeper than sadness, from fury, from humiliation, from the specific grief of realizing that someone who was supposed to love you had been calculating your destruction for years. I cried until I had nothing left. And then I stopped, because Sophie made a small sound in the back seat. She was still sleeping. She reached out in her sleep and pulled Gerald a little tighter. I looked at my daughter's face in the rearview mirror, and something happened that I cannot fully explain, even now. The grief drained out of me completely. What replaced it was not hope. Hope felt too soft for what this was. It was something harder. something cold and precise and absolutely focused. I had spent 14 years at a bank learning one fundamental truth. Every financial crime leaves a trail. You cannot move money without a record. You cannot hide assets without a structure. And every structure, no matter how sophisticated, has a weakness. My father was not smarter than me. He had simply assumed I would never fight back. The next morning, I was sitting in a free legal aid office in the Bronx when I saw him across the waiting room. A man in his mid-40s, rumpled jacket, coffee cup, reading a case file that was thick as a brick. He had the look of someone who had once been important and was still deciding what to do about it. His name was Nolan Reed. He had been a forensic accountant, one of the best in New York, I would later learn. And Richard Belmont had personally destroyed his career 3 years earlier. A false ethics complaint, a fabricated paper trail, a professional death sentence delivered with a smile. He looked up from his file, looked at me, looked back down. "You have the face," he said, without looking up again, "of someone whose father just robbed them." I stared at him. "How did you know it was my father?" He finally looked up, and for the first time in weeks, I was sitting across from someone who was not afraid of Richard Belmont. "Because," Nolan said, "it's always the father." He slid his coffee across the table toward me. "Sit down," he said. "We have work to do." Let me tell you something about forensic accountants. They are the most dangerous people in any room. Not because they carry weapons, not because they raise their voices, but because they see the thing nobody else can see, the invisible architecture of a lie, the skeleton underneath the skin of a fraudulent empire. Nolan Reed could look at a spreadsheet the way a surgeon looks at an X-ray. And my father's financial structure, Nolan told me on that first morning over bad coffee in the Bronx, was not nearly as clean as Richard Belmont believed it to be. "He's arrogant," Nolan said, spreading documents across the table. "Arrogant men make elegant crimes, and elegant crimes have elegant weaknesses." We worked for 11 days straight. I want you to understand what those 11 days looked like. Not glamorous, not cinematic. A rented room above a laundromat in Washington Heights. 2 laptops. A whiteboard covered in names and arrows and dollar amounts. Sophie doing her homework in the corner, while Nolan and I cross-referenced shell company registrations until 2 in the morning. Nolan had kept everything from his own investigation 3 years prior. Every document Richard's lawyers had tried to bury. Every transaction record he had managed to copy before they stripped his credentials and escorted him from the building. And I had something Nolan didn't have. I had access. Not to the accounts, not yet. But I had Daniel. My husband believed I had surrendered. I had called him 4 days after leaving, voice soft, words carefully chosen. I told him I was exhausted, that he was right, that I just wanted it to be over. I could feel his relief through the phone, the specific relief of a guilty man who believes he has escaped consequence. We met for coffee. I wore no makeup. I looked exactly as defeated as he needed me to look. And while he talked, explaining in that careful attorney's voice what the custody arrangement would look like, how the asset division would proceed, I did something very simple. I pressed record on my phone. Daniel talked for 41 minutes. He explained with remarkable specificity exactly how my father had approached him, the amount of the payment, the account it came from, the precise language Richard had used when he said, "Get her to sign the waiver, and I'll make sure you never have to worry about money again." 41 minutes of a man confessing to fraud, bribery, and conspiracy. He thought he was having coffee with a broken woman. He was actually handing me the first brick of his own prison cell. That recording bought us the server access we needed. I sat across from Daniel one more time, this time with Nolan on the phone in my earpiece, and I explained, quietly, what would happen if he chose not to cooperate. He provided the credentials to Richard's company's server within the hour. What we found inside that server was breathtaking in its audacity. My mother's inheritance, reclassified as investment losses, and redistributed through 4 shell companies registered in Delaware, the Cayman Islands, and Cyprus. Luxury purchases, a yacht, 2 country club memberships, a custom car, all coded as educational expenses for dependents. My name, attached to charges I had never seen, for a life I had never lived. But here was the thing that made Nolan set down his coffee cup and go completely still. The transfer was scheduled for Thursday, 6 a.m. $8 million. My mother's money plus 3 years of additional tax evasion, moving to a private bank account in Cyprus beyond the reach of American law. Today was Monday. We had 72 hours. We could take this to the FBI, Nolan said. We will, I said, but not yet. Because here is what 14 years in financial analysis had taught me. You don't stop a man like Richard Belmont by catching him. You stop him by making sure there is nothing left worth catching. Before the law touched a single dollar, I was going to take it first. I spent Tuesday learning everything about the 3 shell companies holding his assets, their stock structures, their vulnerabilities, the specific pressure points where a coordinated short position, a strategic bet that those companies would collapse, could drain them to zero before the Thursday transfer ever executed. It is called short selling. Perfectly legal, brutally effective. My father had taught me about markets when I was 12 years old, sitting on his lap in his home office. He had been so proud of how quickly I learned. He had taught me every technique I was about to use against him. Wednesday night, Nolan and I filed a sealed emergency complaint with the FBI Financial Crimes Division. We handed them the server data, the audio recording, the shell company records, and a complete forensic map of every dollar Richard Belmont had moved in 3 years. Then I sat down at my laptop and I shorted every single company my father owned. I did not sleep that night. I sat in that room above the laundromat and I watched the positions build, and I thought about my mother, a pharmacist from Queens who worked double shifts on holidays and clipped coupons and built $4 million from pure, stubborn dignity. I thought about Sophie, asleep in the next room, arms around a stuffed elephant. I thought about my father on his yacht, sleeping soundly, completely certain that his daughter had been neutralized. At 4:47 a.m. on Thursday morning, the markets opened in Asia, and Richard Belmont's empire began to bleed. The courtroom smelled like old wood and cold coffee. I had been in financial hearings before, as an analyst, as an expert witness, as someone sitting on the comfortable side of the table. I knew how these rooms worked. I knew the rhythms, the formalities, the careful, measured language that powerful men use to make theft sound like paperwork. Richard Belmont walked in looking exactly like Richard Belmont always looked. Tanned, confident, a suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent. He glanced at me once, a quick, dismissive look, the kind you give a problem you've already solved, and then turned to whisper something to his attorney. He believed this was a formality, the final signing of my surrender. The judge called the session to order. Richard's attorney began presenting the asset documentation. Everything clean, everything accounted for. A masterpiece of legal fiction that had taken years to construct. I let him finish. Then I stood up. I connected my iPad to the courtroom display screen, and I pulled up something very simple. Not a complex financial model, not 100 pages of forensic analysis. A receipt. One receipt. From a marine supply company in Fort Lauderdale. $74,000 in yacht parts, custom teak decking, a navigation system, a set of hand-stitched leather interior panels. Filed under educational expenses. Dependent, Maya Belmont. Then another receipt. A private golf club in Palm Beach. Annual membership, guest fees, 3 years of charges. Filed under educational expenses. Dependent, Maya Belmont. I looked at my father. He was no longer whispering to his attorney. I showed them 41 receipts. 41 purchases for a life of extraordinary luxury, all disguised as my education. I showed them the shell companies. The Cyprus transfer, scheduled for, I checked my watch, approximately 40 minutes from now. 40 minutes that would never arrive. Because at that exact moment, the doors at the back of the courtroom opened. 4 people in dark jackets, FBI credentials held open in their hands. Moving quietly, professionally, with the calm efficiency of people who have done this many times before. Richard Belmont stood up, and for the first time in my entire life, I watched my father not know what to do next. They walked him out in handcuffs. He did not look at me on his way past. I think he could not bear to. The man who had outmaneuvered banks, attorneys, and regulators for 30 years, undone by 41 receipts and a daughter he had underestimated completely. The Cyprus transfer was frozen at 6:02 a.m. 11 companies liquidated before noon. The short positions closed. My mother's money, every dollar of it, entered the recovery process. I stood outside the courthouse on a gray November morning. Sophie was at school. Nolan was somewhere behind me on his phone. The city moved around me the way New York always moves, indifferent, relentless, magnificent. I did not feel triumphant. That surprised me. I had expected something explosive, joy, relief, the satisfaction of a perfect ending. Instead, I felt quiet, hollowed out in a way that was not unpleasant. Like a room after the furniture has been rearranged and the windows finally opened. Here is what I know now that I did not know before any of this happened. The version of me who stood in that penthouse, curating her Instagram, performing a life she couldn't afford, measuring her worth in square footage and designer labels. That woman was already lost, long before the money disappeared. She had been lost for years. Losing everything did not destroy me. It simply showed me what I actually was underneath all the noise. My mother never needed a penthouse to know her own value. She clipped coupons and played Steinway piano on Sunday mornings and built a fortune, one quiet, dignified dollar at a time. She knew something I had to learn the very hard way. What you perform is not what you are. Sophie asked me that evening, curled against my side, if we were going to be okay. I thought about everything. The parking garage, the laundromat room, the 41 receipts, the handcuffs. Yes, I told her. And for the first time in a very long time, I was not performing. I meant it completely.